Hello, everyone. This is the second part of a three-part series. So, in case you are not familiar with the labor theory of value and have watched the first part, you should do so. In this part, I'm going to cover Marx's writings on macroeconomics. In the previous part, we have looked at the individual capital and how it functions in the market. Now we will look at the social capital, the sum of all individual capitals. So, how do we describe the social capital, the entirety of a capitalist economy? Well, we know two things about any capital. Every capital undergoes the following process. First, we have money used as capital, which is then used in production to produce a commodity. That commodity is sold for a surplus. So, this formula applies. And secondly, any capital can be split into three parts: constant capital, variable capital, and surplus capital. Those formulas are sufficient for an individual capital, but they can't describe the entirety of capitalist economic production. Everything is traded back and forth. There doesn't really seem to be a beginning and an end. However, things will get clear if we look at production. There are two types of commodities we can produce: means of production, which have no use value for the individual. Think of something like steel. No customer is going to buy a steel bar in order to put it around the house. And articles of consumption, which hold use value for the individual, are used for them. Something like houses, bread, books, and so on. So, we can put production into two sectors, Sector 1 and Sector 2, based on what they are producing. Sector 1 produces means of production, and Sector 2 produces articles of consumption. Sector 1 and 2 together would comprise the total social capital and therefore the capitalist economy as a whole. So, and a reminder, an individual capitalist can have capital active in both sectors. He can produce means of production as well as articles of consumption. The exact property relations don't matter here. What matters is that the whole thing happens within a capitalistic system. So, how do those two sectors interact? Within this example, we are going to work with assumptions. Assumption 1: the workers spend their entirety of income on articles of consumption because wages are just really that low and they don't save. This would be optimal for the capitalists within such an economy. Second assumption: capitalists use their entire money as capital. They only accumulate, they don't buy articles of consumption themselves. Assumption 3: no trade with foreign nations occurs. A completely isolated capitalistic economy. Alright, so with that out of the way, we know about the capital in Sector 1 and Sector 2, that they still can be divided into constant capital, variable capital, and surplus capital. Each sector produces its capital first as a bundle of products, then sells them on the market. Mutual or equal exchange is used to distribute them. Well, the constant capital of Sector 1 stays within Sector 1. The means of production used to produce further means of production stay simply within the sector. They have no further bearing on economy since they stay within one sector. The variable capital of Sector 2 also stays within Sector 2. Think of it like this: the capitalists producing articles of consumption pay their workers wages, and those same workers use those wages in turn to get articles of consumption back from them. Well, the variable capital and surplus of Sector 1 equals the constant capital of Sector 2. Sector 1 can only make money by selling their means of production to some other sector. And, well, the only sector capable of buying it would be Sector 2, since Sector 2 needs to use means of production in order to produce articles of consumption. Sector 2 buys means of production from Sector 1 and therefore enables profit. Well, in here, the constant capital and surplus of Sector 2 are also equal to the variable capital of Sector 1. The only way Sector 2 can make money is to sell their products to workers who don't receive their wages from them, who are employed by some other capital. And the only other capital would be Sector 1. The only stable possible configuration would be one in which there is only constant and variable capital, but no surplus for each sector. This is obviously not the case in reality. So how can this be resolved? Well, one of our assumptions is obviously different from reality. In reality, capitalists don't use the entirety of their money on accumulation. They don't try to invest their entire surplus into more production. In reality, they buy products with it in order to have a better lifestyle. They buy things like mansions, magazines, art, expensive dresses, and all other kinds of status symbols. However, to be clear, any commodity bought by a capitalist is a luxury if it's financed through the possession of capital. It's a luxury. Whether it's a mansion or a toothbrush, what matters is how the buying of the commodity is financed. So we need to introduce another sector, the luxury sector. Let's now look at the sector relations again when we take into account the new luxury sector. So the variable capital and surplus of Sector 1, the sector producing means of production, is equal to the constant capital of Sector 2A and Sector 2B. Anything beyond the means of production used within the means of production themselves needs to be financed by the sale of means of production to the sector that produces articles of consumption both for the capitalist and the worker. Constant capital and the surplus of Sector 2A, the sector producing articles of consumption for the worker, is equal to the variable capital in Sector 1 and Sector 2B. Sector 2A can only get money by selling articles of consumption to workers employed in those other two sectors. The luxury sector draws its money from the profits of capitalists, but other sectors only have surplus due to the spending on luxuries the capitalists do. In other words, according to Marx's idea, the luxury sector drives in a certain way the economy and economic growth, since the other two sectors only can have surplus if the luxury sector produces a sufficient amount. So how would economic growth look within this model? The sector relations would need to be maintained in every single time step of economic growth at every single moment. Otherwise, the production would simply not function. So, however, every capital in Sector 1, Sector 2A, or Sector 2B, it still goes through accumulation. The amount of money continuously increases. So, the economy as a whole would necessarily grow. And with this growth, in turn, higher luxury spending could be justified, which would keep an ever-growing production going. In between years, months, or days of production, there are a couple of things that could change. For example, the rate of exploitation could change. The wages could rise or decrease, which would change the sector 2A relative to 2B, depending on whether or not the wages rise. More or less products would be spent on articles of consumption for the worker. Automation would increase the size of sector 1 at the cost of the luxury sector and the variable sector. In this model, the luxury production drives the economy. Now, put a pin in this. We are going to review this thesis later with Luxemburg's views on the whole thing. This basically summarizes Marx's writings regarding so-called expanded reproduction, or the employment of ever larger capital. So, this is the end of the video. Most of the things I've described I've taken from Capital Volume 2, specifically the section on expanded reproduction. In the next part of the series, the final part, I am going to move on to the namesake of the series herself, Rosa Luxemburg, and her writings in Accumulation of Capital. The video should be out relatively soon, considering that hopefully this time I'm not going to get sick and have to delay everything by about a week. And well, stay tuned for the next part.